that I'm not wearing reading glasses, which is really something that I have to contend with. But let me see if I can get through this here. Sinead has already really wonderfully enumerated the many reasons why the answer to the question that's posed in the title of this session might indeed not be a resounding yes. It rather begs the question of whether we do fit the category of a free and democratic society in that sense. My talk is trying to address that question in first rather directly. I've divided it into two parts. The first part in which I'm going to, if you like, address the question in debating style, you know, and look through the words in it and see what their significance is to where we find ourselves in Ireland today. And that will be my approach, but I have no more expertise necessarily in this area than anybody else in this room. And then secondly, I want to try to talk about something that I hope I do have a little more expertise about, than some of you anyway, which is the media and the role of media in a functioning democratic republic or otherwise where we may find ourselves. It was, I guess, in my function as a media person that I got an invitation in the Post this week from the Houses of the Oireachtas, a seminar to mark International Day of Democracy. Some UN International Day of Democracy, which is September 15th, mark it in your calendar. The Houses of the Oireachtas invites you, which is interesting grammar, the Houses of the Oireachtas invites you to attend a seminar to mark International Day of Democracy 2011. Professor Michael Marsh of Trinity College Dublin will present the findings from his major study of the general election 2011. Which I thought was an interesting indication of the kind of hollowed out conception of democracy that's at play here. If we want to talk about democracy, let's get someone in to talk about the election. Because that's about as close as we come. Every few years, for a few hours, we invite people to go into a voting booth and to write some numbers on a piece of paper, and most of us do it, most of us who are eligible to do it, but the notion that constitutes democracy for the other 365 days of the other years in which elections don't take place is really one that I think is really worth addressing. I mean, these words, obviously, you know, democratic republic are words that are very much abused. You know, we have Democratic People's Republic, for example, of Korea, and no disrespect to the achievements of the people of that country, but I think at least a couple of those words probably aren't a very accurate description of the organization of the state in that place. Republic is not a word that exercises me or troubles me greatly. I think it's a fairly elastic word. But democracy is has a pretty straightforward meaning. Democracy means that power resides in the people. It's very difficult for me to look around Ireland in 2011, or indeed any other time that I've been here, but it's particularly acute at this time where we find ourselves, you know, if you listen to the Taoiseach during the week, essentially handing over the authority for the decisions that were upcoming to the Troika. The question of whether power resides in the Irish people or if even resides in the Irish Taoiseach is a very open one today. I don't say this in the effort to be sort of more radical than now and to sort of say, "I'm God, it's a bourgeois democracy. Damn it, how dare you call that democracy?" I think it's a very simple question, though, and one that the answer is sadly suggests that we are, whatever about our republic, we are certainly lacking in democracy, and that's with all respect. I mean, my own academic background is in history, and I have a great reverence for the people who fought for both democracy and republic in this country and elsewhere. People who fought within the context of imperialism, for example, the Chartist movement in the 19th century, for an extension of democratic rights, many of which we still don't have, and which would enhance our democracy, for example, annual parliaments and a simpler process for recalling our representatives. Obviously the suffrage movement, many of whom in Ireland were content to fight for women's votes within the context of British imperialism. Of course, many of whom weren't, and that's a great and interesting moment and set of arguments in the history of Irish radical struggle. And then, of course, respect for those who sought to break with imperialism and to seek a democratic republic within the context of an independent Ireland. However, I think that certainly the situation in which we find ourselves today raises very profound questions about whether that democratic republic is achievable within the context of the structures established thus far, and even potentially in the future by that struggle. To somewhat misquote David Harvey, whose book title I referred to earlier, The Enigma of Capital, the mere conquest of state power does not a revolution make. And I think that is certainly something that has resonance for us today. States, as we find them, are probably a necessary condition for making genuine change, but they are insufficient, and I'll come back and talk about that in a minute. As I say, it's all the more true now in the context of the Troika, but I'm delighted to see Conor McCabe here in the front row. I've been reading and rereading his excellent book, Sins of the Father. Buy it at the stand outside, I understand, but Conor's historical perspective on Ireland's economy is extraordinary, particularly for how in the period immediately after independence, the new state was happy to see the economy develop and to continue to function as essentially the dirty end of a wider British economy, that essentially, running live cattle from the Irish countryside to, not even for slaughter here in Ireland, but for slaughter and exploitation of the resource of one of our best resources, i.e. essentially the resource of our grass, was that resource was being exploited largely in Britain to the benefit of a small class of ranchers and dealers here in Ireland, but for the larger benefit of, if you like, of a neo-colonial British establishment. And that has, I won't summarize Conor's book here, but has fascinating consequences for the later development of the financial and property economy here, and I think it's essential for understanding where we're at today. So the mere achievement of state power was not sufficient, even with formal democracy, not sufficient to create the conditions where people were empowered, not only economically but politically, to bring about a society to their wider benefit. So the media. The media is largely complicit in the behavior and priorities of the state. Journalists, powerful journalists, move in and out of the corridors of power. They often move in and out of positions as public relations people for people in power. The state allows journalism to exercise a toothless system of self-regulation in terms of its alleged codes of conduct. I came across a good story. It's not from Ireland, but it's from Britain. John Keane, writing an article in an Australian publication recently, was quoting from Tony Blair's memoir. Now, it's not often that you would find me, or as he says, John Keane, quoting Tony Blair's memoirs, but the story is the celebration of the Millennium Dome, New Year's Eve, 1999-2000, and Blair recalls with special horror his discovery that a pack of top journalists, no mere subs or reporters, but people with big titles, top London journalists who've been invited to these celebrations have been left stranded at an underground station, which was full of ordinary people, and you had to wait a while to get a train. And Blair was outraged by this. He grabbed the lapels of the minister in charge, his old friend, Lord Charlie Falconer. Please, please, dear God, says Blair, please tell me you didn't have the media coming here by tube from Stratford, just like ordinary members of the public. And Falconer says, well, we thought it would be more democratic that way. And Blair says, democratic? What fool thought that? They're the media, for Christ's sake. They write about the people, they don't want to be treated like them. And Falconer says, well, what did you want us to do? Get them all a stretch limo? And Blair says, yes, Charlie, with a boy or girl of their choice and as much champagne as they can drink. Now, I must say, I've obviously never been a top journalist because I've never been invited to a stretch limo with a boy or girl of my choice, but it does suggest that the kind of relationship that exists at those top levels of media and political power, it's in some ways quite interesting in light of the ideal by which the press continues to present itself as the fourth estate, as the guardian of, as a watchdog, as the guardian of the powerful, an ideal which is really, I would argue, a product of the Enlightenment, the 18th century Enlightenment, and also probably got stuck there. Thomas Jefferson famously said that he would, given the choice between newspapers without government or government without newspapers, he would choose the first, because as far as he was concerned, a proper democratic republic couldn't function without being able to communicate with the people and to hear their ideas aired and to have its own policies challenged by a free press. And that struggle for liberty of the press in the 18th century, which happened here, which happened in very famously in Britain in the 1760s and 70s with John Wilkes, where liberty of the press, and then in France, in the revolutionary period, press liberty was also a crucial value of that. But I think I would argue that that particular form, that particular notion has little to do with the reality today. And already by the late 19th century, this idea of the independence and consequence of press freedom had really evolved into quite a convenient fig leaf for capitalists who were using the press to exercise private privilege and power. I would also, of course, defend the ideal in some way as of some utility for us, as we, I think, at the moment find ourselves in a transition out of the period of professional journalism, which I think is in a terminal period, at least in the private sector, and into a period in which information will have to be created and exchanged freely by the likes of you and me. And in those cases, we need to, of course, defend such protections as exist for free speech and free communication by press or otherwise. The media here in Ireland, and I know that we'll be talking later today about the EU, about the bailout, about the Eurozone crisis, etc. The media here has tended to like to view itself, particularly the national media, as in some way cosmopolitan, and it views the EU as a lovely cosmopolitan institution to which it gives largely uncritical obedience. The extent to which, in particular, journalists who go to Brussels go native there and become ingrained in the institutions of the superstate in Europe is really very striking. But I would also argue, and this is the final point I want to make, sort of bringing together the media and the question of the democratic republic, I would also argue that our media, and particularly in relation to this crisis, but in general, are shockingly and desperately and conveniently parochial, local, personal, in trying to understand the problems that we face. And I think that we should be struggling against that at all times in our own understanding, our own discourse, and our own critiques of the situation in which we find ourselves. In other words, we have to be global. We have to be structural, rather than being parochial and personal. In other words, the problem is not necessarily this government or that government. The problems that we face today are not necessarily problems that, as I suggested earlier, states as we find them are in a position to address. And I've been quite encouraged. I know that this, in the same slot in last year's school, you had Dr. Andy Story from UCD was one of the speakers. Andy, who is a development economist and an activist on many fronts, Andy has found himself over the last 6 months on a kind of a magical mystery tour of the debt capitals of Europe, I see him regularly, but he's usually about to fly off to another international conference on creating solidarity among, particularly among the peripheral countries, but also making links with people in the likes of Germany, who we are led to believe we are bound to be in a kind of a currency war with, or something like that. That we need sovereignty against Germany. We don't need sovereignty against the German people. We need solidarity with the German people. And Andy has found really extraordinary and interesting comrades and colleagues across Europe, and indeed from places further afield. Most notably, I think Argentina has been providing great lessons in the way one would approach a crisis of the sort that Ireland finds itself in, particularly given that Argentina had some of the same currency issues that we have, in the sense that it was linked to the dollar at the time of its own crisis. In any case, I think that if we are interested, as I hope we are, in moving towards a genuine democratic People's Republic of Ireland, we understand that in order to do so, we're going to have to do it hand in hand with comrades who find themselves in similar positions across the world. Thank you.